Eleanor Whitmore did not cry when her brother handed her the deed. She did not beg. She did not argue. She stood perfectly still in the middle of that crumbling farmhouse, while Thomas looked at her with the particular kind of pity that is more cruel than hatred. And she took the paper from his hand with a grip so steady it made him look away first. Then she folded it once, pressed it against her chest, and whispered the only words she would allow herself that day. "All right then, all right. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that bell so you never miss a single episode. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And stay with us, because what Eleanor builds from this broken ground is going to leave you breathless. Now let's begin. The deed was wrinkled at the corners where Thomas had folded and unfolded it too many times, the way a man does when he has been rehearsing a conversation he knows is wrong. Eleanor noticed that detail the moment he set it on the dining table between them. She noticed everything. She always had. It was the particular skill of a woman who had spent her entire life being looked past. You learned to read the small things because nobody ever handed you the large ones directly. Thomas cleared his throat. He straightened his vest. He looked at a point somewhere above her left shoulder, which was what he always did when he could not meet her eyes. "It belonged to the Harker family," he said. 60 acres, eastern edge of the county. Good soil underneath all the overgrowth, I'm told. The house needs work, but it stands." Eleanor looked at the deed. Then she looked at her brother. "You told me you were bringing me here to discuss options," she said. Her voice was level. She had learned to keep it level. "This is an option. This is a decision you already made." Thomas pulled at his collar. "Eleanor, I turned down Robert Ames last week," she said. "Is that what this is about?" The silence that followed told her everything. Thomas's wife, Catherine, was seated at the far end of the table, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the embroidery frame she was not using. Catherine had been embroidering nothing for 20 minutes. Eleanor had noticed that too. "Robert Ames is a good man," Thomas said. "He has a house. He has income. He was willing—" "He called me a heifer." Eleanor said it plainly, without heat, the way you state a fact about weather. "He said it to Franklin Webb at the hardware store, and Franklin's wife told half the women in town before Sunday services. He said he was willing to overlook my—" She paused, just for a breath. "My condition, if the dowry was substantial enough. So I sent him a note declining. And that is why I am sitting in your dining room looking at a deed for land nobody wants." "That is not why," Thomas said, but his ears had gone red. "Thomas." Her voice did not waver. "Look at me." He did finally. He was 41 years old, her brother, and he was a man who had always believed his good intentions counted for more than his actions. He genuinely thought, Eleanor understood, that he was helping her. That was almost the worst part of it. "You cannot stay here indefinitely," he said. "Catherine and I have discussed it. The children are growing. We need the room. And you?" He stopped. "And I what?" she asked quietly. "You are not getting any younger," he said. "And you have—" Another stop, another search for words that would sound kind. "You have let yourself go, Eleanor. Since Mama passed. I worry about you. I do. And a farm, land of your own, gives you something to do. Something to focus on. It gives you purpose," Eleanor said. "Yes." "You are giving me a ruined farm so that I have something to do," she said. "Because you believe I am too fat and too old and too unmarriageable to be anything other than a problem that needs to be managed." Catherine made a small sound into her embroidery. Thomas's face went through several transformations. Guilt came first, then a flash of defensiveness. Then something that settled into the fixed expression of a man who has decided that what he is doing is, ultimately, for the best. "I am giving you property," he said. "Most women in your situation would be grateful." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and picked up the deed. She folded it once, neat and deliberate. She pressed it against the front of her dress, above her heart, just for a second. Then she tucked it into her coat pocket and pushed back her chair. "I need to arrange transport," she said. "How soon do you need me gone?" She did not wait to see his expression change. The farm was worse than Thomas had described, which surprised Eleanor not at all. She arrived on a Thursday in late June, on the back of a borrowed wagon driven by a taciturn man named Orville, who said exactly 4 words to her during the entire 2-hour journey and seemed to consider that generous. The road to the Harker property, her property, she made herself think it that way immediately, was rutted and grown over at the edges, and the last half-mile was barely a road at all, more a memory of one. When the wagon crested the final rise and she saw it for the first time, Orville let out a breath through his nose that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but was definitely an opinion. Eleanor climbed down before he could offer to help. She stood in front of the farmhouse and she looked at it. The porch sagged on one side where a support had given way, tipping the whole front of the house at an angle that made it look apologetic. 3 of the 4 front windows were intact, which was better than she had expected. The front door hung slightly open, which was worse, because it meant animals had likely gotten in over the years and made themselves comfortable. The paint was peeled down to bare gray wood in most places. The chimney had lost some stones from the upper portion. A previous attempt at a kitchen garden along the south wall had long since gone to weeds and thistle. Behind the house, she could see the barn, which leaned. Not collapsed. Leaned, the way an old man leans on a fence, tired but still standing. The chicken coop was a collection of boards that had apparently given up the argument of being a structure and were simply lying near each other in vague association. The fence lines that marked the property edges had gaps every 30 or 40 yards where posts had rotted and rails had fallen. 60 acres of all of it. 60 acres of grass gone wild, of fields gone fallow, of a decade's worth of indifference pressing down on every board and stone and fence post. Orville set her trunk and her 2 crates down in the dirt beside the wagon without comment. "You'll be all right then," he said, which was his longest sentence of the day, and she understood it was not a question. He climbed back up, turned the wagon, and was gone down the rutted road before she had taken more than 3 steps toward the house. Eleanor stood in the quiet. There were birds somewhere in the overgrown fields. There was wind through the tall grass. There was the creak of the barn shifting slightly, that slow lean continuing its long conversation with gravity. There was the smell of sun on dry earth and old wood and something green and alive underneath all the neglect. She put her hands on her hips. She was wearing her second-best dress because her best one was packed, and she was already too warm in it, and her feet hurt from the wagon bench, and she had not eaten since before dawn because Orville had not stopped and she had not asked him to. She was 28 years old, and she was standing in front of 60 acres of nobody's problem. And the man who had put her here believed she would fail quietly enough that he wouldn't have to think about it too hard. She thought about Thomas's face when she'd taken the deed. She thought about Robert Ames, who had considered her a condition to be overlooked at sufficient financial incentive. She thought about the women in town, who looked at her with that specific mixture of pity and relief. Pity for her situation, relief that it was hers and not theirs. She looked at the broken-down farmhouse. "All right," she said, to the farm and to herself and to no one. "Let's see what you've got." She picked up one of the crates and carried it toward the door. The inside of the house was dim and smelled of dust and mouse and old wood and something faintly floral that she couldn't identify. Some long-dried bunch of herbs hung in a kitchen. She couldn't see yet, perhaps, left behind by the last woman who had lived here and thought it would always smell like home. The front room had a fireplace, a floor with 2 boards that needed replacing, and a window with a view of the south field that was genuinely beautiful in the late afternoon light. The kitchen behind it was small but functional, the old cast-iron stove intact, the pump at the sink requiring work, but not miracle. There were 2 rooms beyond, one with a rusted bed frame, one with nothing but a bird's nest in the corner and a cracked plaster wall. Eleanor walked through all of it slowly. She touched the walls. She tested the floors with her weight. She worked the pump until it gave a grudging cough of water that was brown at first, and then, eventually, clear. She opened every window that would open. She stood at the back door and looked at the barn and the fields and the broken chicken coop and the fence lines with their gaps. She pulled Thomas's deed from her pocket and unfolded it. 60 acres. Her name. Eleanor Marie Whitmore. She had gone to school with a girl named Alice Pearson, who used to draw horses in the margins of her arithmetic book. Beautiful horses with flowing manes and careful hooves. And when the teacher caught her, she always said she was practicing for when she had a ranch of her own. And everyone always laughed because what girl was going to have a ranch of her own? And Alice had laughed too, but she never stopped drawing the horses. Eleanor had never drawn horses. She had been practical, always. She had kept accounts and learned to preserve food, and studied what her father planted, and why, and which fields he rotated, and when. She had done those things quietly, without announcement, because there had never seemed to be any particular use in announcing them. There was a use now. She folded the deed again, put it back in her pocket, and went to bring in the rest of her things before the light failed. The first person to speak to her in Willow Creek. After the transaction at the general store where she purchased lamp oil and flour and salt pork, and a new handle for the broken pump, conducted entirely in the polite minimum of words, was a woman named Ida Marsh, who ran the post office from a desk at the back of her husband's harness shop. Ida was perhaps 60, with the direct gaze of a woman who has seen enough foolishness that she no longer had any interest in pretending otherwise. "You're the Whitmore girl," Ida said, when Eleanor collected the single piece of mail that had been forwarded from Thomas's address. A bill, naturally. Thomas Whitmore's sister. "I am," Eleanor said. "Took the Harker place," Ida said. It was not a question. "I did." Ida looked at her for a moment with those direct eyes. "You know what that land is?" she said. "I have a fairly detailed understanding, yes," Eleanor said. Something shifted in Ida's expression. Not quite a smile, more like a recalibration. "Come see me if you need anything," she said. "I know most everyone in the county." It was the first uncomplicated kindness anyone had offered her in Willow Creek, and Eleanor felt it land somewhere in her chest like something warm. "Thank you," she said. "I will." The first weeks were the education of her body. Eleanor had grown up in a house with a kitchen garden and a small orchard, and she was not ignorant of physical work. But the farm demanded a different scale of it entirely. Her hands blistered and then hardened. Her back ached in ways that kept her awake the first 3 nights until exhaustion outweighed the pain. She learned which of the porch boards to avoid and which would hold, and then she replaced the ones that wouldn't. She learned the barn's rhythms, how it sounded in wind, where the roof let in light through gaps that would let in rain, which of the crossbeams would take weight and which needed reinforcing before they would. She worked from before sunrise until the light failed, and sometimes after with the lamp. She made a list of everything that needed doing, and she worked down it methodically, not because she had any particular emotional attachment to methodology, but because there was too much to do to waste time deciding what to do next. Patch the porch, replace the pump handle, clear the kitchen garden, repair the chicken coop, address the worst of the barn's lean, begin turning the south field. She found, in the 3rd week, that someone had been watching. She was on the south side of the barn, reinforcing a support beam that had been half-rotted at the base, when she heard hoofbeats on the road and looked up to find a man on a gray horse stopped at the gap in her fence line that she had not yet repaired. He was perhaps 35, weathered in the particular way of men who spend their lives outdoors, with a hat that had seen considerable use and the posture of someone who rode more comfortably than he walked. He was looking at the barn with the expression of a man doing calculations. He saw her see him, and he touched the brim of his hat. "Morning," he said. "Morning," said Eleanor, not stopping work. A pause. "That beam's going to need a proper brace at the base," he said. "Just splicing the rotted section won't hold long." Eleanor looked at the beam, then at him. "I know," she said. "I don't have the lumber for it yet. I'm stabilizing it until I do." Another pause, a longer one. "Benjamin Carter," he said. "I run the Double C, east of here." "Eleanor Whitmore," she said. She had been going to leave it at that, but something made her add, "I own this farm." She said it the way you'd stake a claim, plainly and without apology. "I know," he said, and there was nothing in his voice but acknowledgement. No amusement, no condescension, just the flat recognition of a fact. I've watched you working this property for 3 weeks. Have you? You've done more with it in 3 weeks than the Harker family did in the last 3 years they owned it, he said. Eleanor set down her mallet and straightened up and looked at him directly. He had honest eyes, she noticed. The kind that looked at what was actually there, rather than at some version of it they'd decided on beforehand. "Why have you been watching?" she asked. "Curious," he said simply. "Everybody in town said you'd be gone before July. I wanted to see if they were right." "And?" He looked into the barn. At the repaired porch visible from where he sat. At the kitchen garden, cleared now and beginning to show the first green of planted rows. At her, not the way most men looked at her, with that particular sliding away gaze that took in her heavy frame and then found somewhere else to be, but straight on, the way he'd look at any person he was taking the measure of. "They were wrong," he said. He touched his hat again, turned the gray horse, and rode back toward the road. Eleanor looked after him for a moment. Then she picked up her mallet and went back to work. He came back 4 days later, unannounced and without apparent agenda, and simply asked if she needed a hand with the fence line. She looked at him for a moment, assessing, and then said she reckoned she could use one, and pointed him at the section nearest the road while she worked the back corner. They worked most of the morning without talking much, which suited Eleanor. She had learned that men who felt the need to fill silence usually did so because they were uncomfortable with what the silence might reveal, and Benjamin Carter worked quietly and competently, which told her more about him than a conversation would have. When they stopped at midday, and Eleanor produced biscuits and cold coffee from a cloth sack she'd brought out from the house, he accepted both without comment and sat on a fence rail and looked out at the south field. "What are you planting?" he asked. "Corn in the south field. Kitchen gardens already in. Beans, squash, tomatoes, greens. I want to try wheat in the western acreage, but the soil needs working first." She paused. "The eastern section, along the creek. I'm thinking I leave that in grass this year and put cattle on it next spring." He was quiet for a moment. "You've thought this through?" "I had time," she said. "On the wagon coming out. And the first few nights before I was tired enough to sleep." "Who taught you farming?" he asked. "My father," she said. "Mostly by watching him. He didn't so much teach as do things, and I paid attention." "Your father's gone." 3 years. She looked at the field. "My mother 2 years ago. After that?" She stopped, then started again. "After that it was Thomas's house, and Thomas's opinions about what I should do with myself." She said it without bitterness, which she was aware was its own kind of statement. Benjamin drank his cold coffee. "For what it's worth," he said, "the land is good. Underneath all of this." He gestured at the general state of the place. "The Harker family let it go to waste, but the soil's still there. This could be a real farm." "It is a real farm," Eleanor said. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted in a way she couldn't quite read. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it is." The day Charles Harrington came to her property was a Tuesday, 6 weeks after she'd arrived, and she knew who he was before he introduced himself, because Ida Marsh had told her about him with the particular precision of a woman who has strong opinions and considers it a civic duty to share them. Charles Harrington owned 3,000 acres in the eastern part of the county. He was 52, twice widowed, and had a way of surveying everything he looked at as though calculating what it might be worth to him. He arrived with 2 men behind him, which Eleanor recognized as a particular kind of statement. Not that he needed help, but that he wanted witnesses to how easy this conversation would be. He looked at her farm the way Thomas had looked at it when he handed her the deed, with the expectation of ruin, and found it somewhat less ruined than he'd anticipated, which produced a small shift in his expression that he didn't quite manage to conceal. "Miss Whitmore," he said, without taking off his hat, "I've heard you've been working this land." "Mr. Harrington," she said. She was on the porch, standing, which meant she was slightly above him, which she did not think was an accident on either of their parts. "I have." "I'd like to make you an offer," he said, "for the property." "I'm not selling." "You haven't heard the offer." "I don't need to," Eleanor said. "I'm not selling." Harrington looked at her with the patience of a man who was accustomed to waiting out resistance. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "this is a considerable piece of work you've taken on. Alone." He said the word alone the way you'd say it about a child attempting to move a boulder. "And you've done." He looked around, performing reluctant concession. "More than most expected. But 60 acres is a significant operation. A woman in your—" He searched for the word with the same particular delicacy Thomas always showed. "A woman in your circumstances might find the ongoing demands." "My circumstances," Eleanor said. "Yes. And what are my circumstances, Mr. Harrington?" He met her eyes. He was a man used to being direct when directness suited him. "You are alone," he said. "You have no husband, no hired hand, no family support that I've been made aware of. And this land," he nodded at the 60 acres, "requires what I expect you do not have." "Which is?" "Capital," he said, "and endurance." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Let me tell you something," she said, and her voice was absolutely even, the way still water is even before a stone hits it. "When I arrived here 6 weeks ago, there was no kitchen garden. There was no repaired barn. The chicken coop was a pile of boards. The porch would have taken your weight through to the ground. The south field hadn't been turned in a decade." She gestured, not with the sweeping grandeur of someone performing for an audience, but the practical gesture of a woman pointing at work she's done. "I have done all of that in 6 weeks, alone, with the capital I had and the endurance I've built my entire life." She looked at him directly. "I will not be selling, Mr. Harrington, but I thank you for riding out." One of the men behind him coughed into his fist. Harrington looked at her for another moment. He was not a man who was often turned down, she could see that. He was working out whether to press the point. He decided not to. He touched his hat, finally, and turned his horse. "Offer stands," he said, as he rode. "So does my answer," Eleanor said to his back. She stood on the porch until the three of them had gone back down the road. Then she went inside and sat down at her kitchen table and put her face in her hands for approximately 30 seconds. Not crying, just feeling the shape of the last 10 minutes. And then she stood up and went back to work. That evening, Benjamin Carter arrived with a load of lumber in his wagon. "For the barn brace," he said, before she could ask. Eleanor looked at the lumber, then at him. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "No," he agreed. "I can't accept a gift like this." "It's not a gift," he said. "I've been meaning to clear out some of that stack from my own supply for a while. It's getting in the way. You'd be doing me a favor taking it." It was, she recognized, a very carefully constructed offer. It preserved every relevant dignity. She could accept it without obligation, and he could give it without anything being made of it. She looked at the lumber for another moment. "All right," she said. "Thank you." "Harrington came by," he said. It was not a question. "He did." "And?" "And I said no." Benjamin looked at her in that straight-on way he had. "He'll come back," he said. "I know," she said. "He's welcome to keep asking." Something that was almost a smile moved across Benjamin Carter's face. He was not, she had noticed, a man given to smiling easily, which meant that when it happened, it registered. "You need a hand unloading this?" he asked. "I wouldn't say no," she said. They unloaded the lumber in the last of the evening light, working efficiently and mostly in silence. And when it was done, he drove back down the road, and Eleanor stood watching the wagon until it rounded the bend, and then she looked at the lumber neatly stacked by the barn and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not gratitude, exactly. Or not only that, something more like the feeling of being seen clearly and treated accordingly, which was rarer and more sustaining than she'd ever been told it would be. She went inside and wrote in the small ledger she kept by the lamp. Costs, progress, what was done, and what remained. And before she closed it, she wrote one line that was not an account of anything practical. "Someone looked at what I am building and thought it worth helping." She closed the ledger. She turned down the lamp. Through the window, in the dark, her farm was quiet and imperfect and entirely hers. She thought, let them keep expecting me to fail. She thought, I have work to do. The lumber. Benjamin Carter left behind became the backbone of the barn's north wall, and Eleanor worked it herself for 3 straight days, getting the brace set deep enough into the ground that it would hold through a Montana winter. She did not have a great deal of experience with structural carpentry, but she had her father's copy of a farming almanac from 1861 that had a chapter on barn construction, and she had the particular stubbornness of a woman who has decided that not knowing how to do something is a problem with a solution, not a permanent condition. On the second day, a boy of about 12 appeared at the gap in the fence line and watched her work. Eleanor glanced at him. "You lost?" she asked. "No, ma'am," he said. "I live up the road. My ma sent me to see if you needed anything." "Your ma," Eleanor said. "What's her name?" "Ruth Alderman," the boy said. "I'm Pete." Eleanor had not yet met Ruth Alderman, but she had seen the farmhouse about a mile north, a tidy place with a working garden and clean laundry on the line. She had formed a favorable opinion of Ruth Alderman on the basis of that laundry alone. There was a particular competence communicated by how a woman hung her sheets. "Tell your mother thank you," Eleanor said, "and tell her I'm managing fine, but if she ever wants to trade preserves, I'll have a good tomato crop in August." Pete looked at the barn. "You're doing that yourself?" he said, with the frank amazement of a child who has not yet learned to disguise his opinions. "I am," Eleanor said. "My pa says a woman can't do barn work." "Your pa," Eleanor said pleasantly, "is welcome to come see how wrong he is." Pete laughed, surprising himself, and ran back up the road. 3 days later, Ruth Alderman appeared at Eleanor's door with a jar of blackberry jam and an expression of carefully contained curiosity. And by the end of that visit, Eleanor had her first friend in Willow Creek. Ruth was 44, practical, and sharp as a new blade, with the warm directness of a woman who had decided long ago that life was too short for circling around things. She sat at Eleanor's kitchen table and drank coffee and looked around the cleaned and partially repaired interior of the farmhouse and did not say anything about what she must have expected to see before she walked in. "The whole town's got opinions about you," Ruth said. "I know," Eleanor said. "Most of them are wrong. I know that too." Ruth looked at her. "Thomas Whitmore's my husband's second cousin," she said. "I want you to know I think what he did was shameful, handing you that land like it was doing you a favor." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "He believed it," she said finally. "That's the particular thing about Thomas. He never does anything he doesn't believe is right. He just has a very limited imagination about what right looks like." Ruth considered this. "That's a generous read," she said. "I spent a lot of miles on that wagon working up to it," Eleanor said. Ruth laughed, a real laugh, unpretentious and sudden. And Eleanor found herself laughing too, and that was how the friendship began, the way the best ones do, with the surprise of genuine recognition. By the end of July, the south field was fully turned and planted. By mid-August, the kitchen garden was producing more than Eleanor could eat, and she began setting aside the surplus. Carefully, methodically, preserving and drying and canning with the precision of someone who understood that abundance in summer is the margin between comfort and hardship in winter. The chicken coop, rebuilt now from actual lumber rather than wishful thinking, had 12 hens. The eggs alone were covering a portion of her costs. It was Ruth who first suggested the idea. "You've got more than you need," Ruth said one afternoon, looking at the rows of preserved jars on Eleanor's kitchen shelves. "And the mercantile charges robbery for preserves. Have you thought about selling?" "I've thought about it," Eleanor said. "But I need a consistent supply before I can promise anything to a store. I don't want to make an offer I can't back up." "That's wise," Ruth said. "But you're closer than you think." Eleanor looked at her jars. She thought about the egg production, which was increasing as the flock settled. She thought about the fall harvest coming in the south field, which was looking, against all the expectations of people who didn't know soil the way she was learning to know this soil, genuinely promising. "Maybe," she said. "Definitely," Ruth said. The man at the mercantile was named Gideon Pierce, And he was the kind of businessman who had survived 20 years in a small town by being exactly as skeptical as the situation required, and not 1 degree more. He looked at the sample jar of tomato preserves. Eleanor sat on his counter, and then looked at her with the measuring gaze of a man evaluating a proposition. "These yours?" he asked. "They are," she said. He opened the jar. He smelled it. He tasted a small amount from his finger, not politely, but with genuine professional assessment. "Harker Place?" he said. "Whitmore Farm," she said. Something shifted in his face. Recalibration, the same as Ida had done. "I heard you were out there," he said. "Heard you'd be gone by July." "It's August," she said. He looked at the jar again. "I can take 6 jars a week to start," he said. "If these sell the way I think they will, we talk about more." 8 jars, Eleanor said. "And I want fair price, not charity price." Gideon Pierce looked at her for a moment. 8 jars, he said. "Fair price." She walked out of the mercantile with a handshake agreement and a figure in her head that, when she worked it against her costs that evening in the ledger, gave her the first number that looked not like survival, but like a beginning. She allowed herself 30 seconds of sitting at the kitchen table, with her hands flat on the surface, feeling the solidity of it. Then she opened the ledger and started planning the fall planting. The gossip about her, she knew, had not stopped. Ruth kept her informed, not out of cruelty, but out of the pragmatic friendship of a woman who believed you were better equipped to handle what you knew about. Margaret Harrington, Charles Harrington's daughter-in-law, had apparently told several women at the dressmakers that the Whitmore woman was making a spectacle of herself, and that the farm would be back on the market before spring. The pastor's wife had expressed concern, the particular performative concern of a woman who enjoys having things to be concerned about, that a woman alone on 60 acres was not a proper situation, and someone ought to look into it. Thomas had heard about the mercantile arrangement, according to Ida Marsh, and had expressed surprise, just that, surprise, not pride, not pleasure. Surprise, as though Eleanor had done something mildly unexpected, like a decorative figurine getting up and walking across a shelf. Eleanor recorded this information in her head and felt it fuel something quiet and steady in her chest, the way a good fire catches and holds. And then Benjamin Carter came back. He came on a Wednesday in the first week of September, and this time he was not carrying lumber or offering a convenient excuse. He simply rode up to the farm, tied his horse at the fence post Eleanor had replaced in the first week, and walked up to where she was working in the kitchen garden, and said, "There's a county harvest fair in 3 weeks. They have a produce competition and a preserves competition. Ida Marsh won the preserves last 4 years running, and she's insufferable about it." Eleanor sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "Is that so?" she said. "I've tasted Ida's preserves," he said. "And I've tasted yours." He paused. "You should enter." "I've been here 4 months," Eleanor said. "I'd be stepping into someone else's territory." "You'd be entering a fair competition," Benjamin said, "which is what the competition is for." Eleanor pulled a weed she'd been about to get to anyway, and thought about it. "Why do you care?" she asked. Howe was quiet for a moment. It was the particular quiet of a man choosing his words because he means them rather than because he's performing thoughtfulness. "Because you have worked this land harder than I've seen anyone work a farm in 10 years, he said. "And every person in this county who thought you'd fail quietly is going to have to sit in a fairground and look at what you've done. And I think you should let them." Eleanor looked at her garden, at the heavy tomatoes still on the vine, at the beans she was harvesting in quantities that had surprised even her, at the rows of squash that were going to come in better than she'd planned. "You just want Ida Marsh to lose," she said. Something that was definitely a smile this time moved across Benjamin Carter's face. "That," he said, "is also true." She entered the fair. The morning of the harvest fair was the first time Eleanor Whitmore walked into a large gathering of Willow Creek residents since her arrival at the farm, and she was under no illusions about what that meant. She had been abstract to most of them. A story people told, a situation they had opinions about, a name that appeared in the kind of conversations women have at the dressmakers and men have at the feed store. Walking into the fairground on a September morning, with 2 jars of preserves under her arm and a basket of produce, she became a specific person in front of a lot of people who had decided what kind of specific person she was before they ever saw her. She felt it. She was not a woman who had ever learned to be insensible to a room's opinion, but she had learned over the course of the last 4 months to feel it and keep walking anyway. Ruth was beside her, which helped. "Head up," Ruth said quietly. "Walk like you own it." "I don't own the fairground," Eleanor said. "Walk like you own the farm then," Ruth said. "You actually do own that." Eleanor squared her shoulders and kept walking. She registered her entries. She set her jars of preserves on the table with the others and looked at Ida Marsh's 4 contributions, which were beautifully presented and smelled excellent. Ida herself was at the far end of the table talking to the pastor's wife, and she looked over when Eleanor set her entries down and gave a nod that was entirely neutral and could have been interpreted as anything. Eleanor nodded back. At the produce table, she arranged her tomatoes and her squash and her beans and a display of the dried herbs she'd been growing along the south wall of the farmhouse, and she stepped back and looked at it, and she thought, "It's good. It's genuinely good." Not from pride, but from the honest assessment of someone who had been looking at produce her entire life and knew the difference between what the soil gives when it's cared for and what it gives when it isn't. She won the preserves competition. She didn't find out until 2 hours later, when the judging was announced and her name was read out, and she was standing with Ruth near the edge of the crowd, and Ruth grabbed her arm so hard it left a mark. The room did something interesting when the announcement was made. There was applause, genuine applause, from people who had tasted the preserves blind and were simply acknowledging what they'd tasted. And then there was a specific sub-register of reaction that Eleanor caught in the faces of the people she'd been watching. The adjustment, the recalibration, the look of something previously decided being quietly revised. Ida Marsh found her in the crowd afterward. Eleanor held her breath slightly. "Well," Ida said. She looked at Eleanor with those direct eyes, and for a moment, Eleanor couldn't read her at all. Then Ida held out her hand. "Fair's fair," she said. "Those tomato preserves were something exceptional. What did you do with the acidity?" "Added a small amount of apple," Eleanor said cautiously. Ida's eyes sharpened with genuine interest. "Now that's clever," she said. "Come see me next week. I want to talk technique." Eleanor shook her hand. On her way back across the fairground, she passed a knot of men near the livestock pens, and she heard her name. Not quietly, because some men do not lower their voices when they are making pronouncements they consider reasonable. From a man she didn't know who was talking to 2 she recognized, one of them being Robert Ames. "The Whitmore woman," the man was saying. "Good for her, I suppose, but the fair was one thing. You wait till winter. 60 acres alone." A particular emphasis on alone. "She won't see spring without selling." Robert Ames said something she couldn't hear. The other man laughed. "Besides," the first man said, "Thomas told me himself she doesn't know the first thing about—" Eleanor kept walking. She did not slow her pace. She did not look over. She kept her chin level, and she walked past, and she felt the words land on her back like something thrown, and she let them, because stopping to fight every thrown thing was a waste of energy she could not afford. What she did instead was go home and write in her ledger. She wrote, "Winter preparation. Must be complete by November. Firewood. Feed stores. Structural checks on barn before first freeze." She wrote, "Will not sell. Will not fail. Will not stop." Then she closed the ledger and slept better than she had in weeks. It was Ida Marsh who told her about James Whitmore. Not Thomas. James, their father's youngest brother, who Eleanor had not seen since she was 14 years old, and who had left the family under circumstances that had always been discussed in the lowered voices reserved for serious things. She knew he had gone west. She knew there had been something about money, or a woman, or both. She knew that his name was not spoken at Thomas's table. What she did not know, what Ida told her on a rainy October afternoon over the kitchen table, with the particular careful precision of a woman who has held a piece of information long enough to know its weight, was that James Whitmore had come through Willow Creek 11 years ago, that he had stopped at the Harker farm, which was still operational then, that he had, according to Ida, who had received a letter about it from her cousin in the eastern part of the county, left something with old Harker, a letter, or possibly a package, addressed to Eleanor specifically. To Eleanor Marie Whitmore, by name. Eleanor stared at her. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. "Because I only just put it together," Ida said, with the directness of a woman who did not find her own delays embarrassing, only factual. "When I heard your name that first day you came in for mail, I knew I'd heard it somewhere. It took me 2 months to remember where, and another month to find my cousin's letter. I am not," she added, "as young as I was." "Harker," Eleanor said. The family that owned my farm." "Yes," Ida said. "They're gone. You told me they moved to Oregon." "They did, 4 years ago." Ida paused. "But they left in a hurry, and they left the house, and whatever was in it, behind." Eleanor was already standing up. She went through the farmhouse the way she had never thought to go through it. Not as a practical woman assessing structural integrity, but as someone looking for something. She went through the kitchen, through the back rooms, through the lean-to at the east side she'd been using as a cold storage area. She went through every shelf and corner and loose board. She found it behind a panel in the lean-to that she had thought was simply a storage niche. A flat tin box, sealed with a rusted clasp, with her name written on the top in handwriting she did not recognize. She sat down on the cold dirt floor of the lean-to with the box in her hands, and she did not open it for a full 2 minutes. Then she opened it. There were 2 things inside, a letter and a smaller envelope. The letter was addressed to her in that same handwriting. She read it twice through without stopping, because her eyes wanted to rush ahead, and she made herself slow down, because she understood that whatever was in this letter had been sitting here for 11 years, waiting for her. James Whitmore. Uncle James, who she remembered as a tall man with her father's eyes and a laugh that came easily, had known, 11 years ago, that the family's finances were in worse condition than anyone admitted. He had not been the cause of the trouble, as the family story implied. He had tried to stop it, and failed, and left rather than watch it unfold. He had left the letter with Harker because he didn't know where Eleanor would end up, but he knew the family connection to that land, and thought eventually someone might find their way here. The smaller envelope contained a promissory note and a deed transfer document. Old, carefully preserved. For 20 acres of land in the eastern section of Willow Creek County, 20 acres that were, according to the document, hers by right of a bequest from her grandmother that Thomas had either not known about or had chosen not to mention. 20 acres that she was currently farming as part of her 60-acre property, because they were contiguous, because nobody had told her they were separately deeded, because nobody had expected her to be here at all. Eleanor sat on the cold floor of the lean-to with the documents in her hands, and she felt something move through her that was not triumph or anger, though both of those were present. What she felt, underneath everything, was a kind of profound and particular grief, for her father, who had not known, for her mother, who had worried in silence, for the years in Thomas's house. And then the grief moved through her and left something harder and cleaner behind it. She got up. She washed her face at the pump. She put on her second-best coat. She drove the wagon into Willow Creek, and she went to find Ida Marsh. "I need a lawyer," she said. "The best one in the county." Ida looked at her face and did not ask any questions. "Martin Gould," she said immediately. "2 streets over. Tell him I sent you." Martin Gould was 60, meticulous, and had the professional impassivity of a man who had heard a great many things in his office and had learned that his own reactions were rarely helpful. He read the documents Eleanor put in front of him with a care that felt like respect for the paper itself. When he was done, he looked up. "These are valid," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "The bequest was registered in this county in 1862, your grandmother's estate." He looked at the documents again. "It's possible your brother was unaware." "It's possible," Eleanor said. Something in her tone made him pause. He looked at her the way a man looks when he is revising an assessment and is honest enough to admit it. "It is also possible," he said carefully. That he was not. Yes, Eleanor said. It is. You have options, he said. I can help you formalize your claim to the 20 acres, which are already within your current holding, and simply require the paperwork to be properly registered in your name. That's straightforward. If you wish to pursue the question of whether this information was withheld deliberately, that is a different conversation. Eleanor looked at the documents on his desk. She thought about Thomas, about his voice when he'd handed her the deed, about the way he'd said, "You have let yourself go, Eleanor," as though he were diagnosing something rather than diminishing it. She thought about his expression when she'd taken the paper, the relief she'd seen there, which she'd understood perfectly at the time, and had chosen to understand only as inadequacy, not malice. She wasn't certain, even now, which it had been. "Formalize the claim," she said. "That's all I want right now." Martin Gould nodded once, precise and respectful. "I'll have the paperwork ready by the end of the week," he said. She walked out of his office into the October air and stood on the street for a moment. Across the way, at the feed store, she could see two men she recognized. Neighbors, not hostile, not friendly, simply present in the general ecosystem of the town. One of them noticed her and nodded. She nodded back. She thought, 20 acres are already mine. She thought, they have always been mine. She walked back to her wagon and drove home to her farm. The news about the documents traveled, because in a town of this size everything traveled, and it reached Thomas before Eleanor chose to tell him herself, which she had known it would. He arrived on a Friday morning, unannounced, in his good coat, driving his own buggy, which meant he'd thought about how this looked. Thomas always thought about how things looked. Eleanor was in the kitchen garden, pulling the last of the fall squash, when she heard the buggy. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her hands, and waited. Thomas climbed down. He looked at the farm, the barn, the repaired house, the garden, the evidence of 4 months of relentless work. And his face did something complicated that he didn't quite manage to resolve before he got close enough for her to see it. "Eleanor," he said. "Thomas," she said. He looked at her hands, which were dirty. He looked at her dress, which was a work dress and not her second best. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man who has arrived to have a conversation. He rehearsed and found the situation somewhat different from what he rehearsed it for. "I heard about the documents," he said. "I thought you might have," she said. "I want you to understand," he started. "Did you know?" she asked. Her voice was level, the same levelness she had maintained in his dining room 4 months ago. "About the bequest. Did you know it existed?" Thomas was quiet. That quiet told her. It was not a long quiet, and when he spoke, he filled it with the particular language of a man who has a great deal to say about intentions and circumstances and the complexity of financial situations that Eleanor could not have been expected to understand. And all of it was, she recognized, true in the way that partial truths are true. There had been debts. There had been a moment of decision. He had told himself she would be provided for through the marriage arrangements, and when those hadn't worked out, "You thought the farm would be enough," Eleanor said. "You thought you'd given me something, so whatever you hadn't told me about balanced out." Thomas stopped. "That's not," he began. "I'm not asking you to apologize," Eleanor said. "I'm telling you that I understand how the arithmetic worked in your head. I just want you to hear that it didn't work out the way you calculated." She gestured at the farm, the odd, working, alive gesture of a woman standing in the middle of something she built. "Because I am still here." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. She could see something moving through him. Guilt, genuine and uncomfortable, the kind that has nowhere good to go. "You've done well," he said. It cost him something to say it. "I have," she said simply. He cleared his throat. "I'd like—" He stopped, started again. "If there's anything you need, going forward, I'd like to be useful." Eleanor looked at her brother. He was 41 years old, and he was a man of limited imagination and genuine, if imperfectly expressed, affection, and he was standing in the dirt of her farm asking to be allowed back into a story he had tried to write the ending of himself. "Come at Christmas," she said. "Bring Catherine and the children. There'll be a proper dinner." He blinked. Yes. Yes, we will." "Good," she said. "Now I have squash to finish pulling." He left. She went back to the garden. And Ruth, who had been entirely invisible in the kitchen and had definitely heard the entire conversation, appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and a look of profound respect. "That," Ruth said, "was magnificent." "It was practical," Eleanor said, taking a cup. "It was both," Ruth said. Benjamin heard about the documents from 2 different people before Eleanor told him herself, which happened the following Sunday when he came by on the pretense of checking the barn brace, which did not need checking, as they both understood. And she poured him coffee and told him the whole story plainly, because she had found that the particular quality of his listening made plain telling feel right. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. 20 acres that were always yours," he said. "Yes. And your brother?" "I've dealt with Thomas," she said. He looked at her. She had noticed, in the months of his company, that he looked at her with a consistency that she was not accustomed to. Not the looking past of men who assessed her appearance and found their gaze elsewhere, but the looking at of a man who found the subject genuinely interesting and was in no hurry to look somewhere else. "You're not angry," he said. It was an observation, not a challenge. "I'm something," Eleanor said. "I'm not sure anger is the largest part of it." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Mostly, I think. I have the land. I have the work. I have what I needed, even if the way I got it was—" She stopped. "Mostly, I think I just want to keep going." Benjamin looked at his own coffee cup for a moment. "There's a community meeting at the church hall next week," he said, "about the road at the county's east edge. It needs repairing, and there's a question about who's responsible. Half the farmers in the county will be there." He paused. "You should come." "I'm not sure I'm—" Eleanor started. "You're a landowner," Benjamin said. 60 acres, properly deeded, including the 20. You have as much right to that meeting as anyone." He met her eyes. "More than some, given where your east fence line sits." Eleanor looked at him. "You're not going to stop, are you?" she said. It was not quite a question. "Pointing out where I have a right to be." "No," he said. He said it simply, without performance. "I'm not." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "I'll come to the meeting." She came to the meeting. She sat in the 3rd row because the 2nd was full and she was not going to sit in the back, and she listened to 40 minutes of debate about road maintenance and county responsibility and shifting costs, and then a man named Alderton, a large landowner, prosperous and accustomed to his own opinion carrying weight, said something about the eastern road being primarily the concern of the larger properties, at which point Eleanor raised her hand, and, when Alderton looked at her with the particular expression of a man who was not expecting a hand from that direction, she stood up and said clearly, "The eastern road directly borders the Whitmore farm. I've got 60 acres running along that section, and I've repaired my own fence line twice this season because of drainage from the road deteriorating. I'd like to hear what the county's position is on responsibility." There was a silence. Not a hostile silence. More the silence of a room reconfiguring. The meeting chairman, a mild, careful man named Hooper, who Eleanor had seen at the fair, looked at her with careful neutrality and said, "Mrs. Whitmore." "Miss Whitmore," she said, pleasantly. "And I'd like an answer." Hooper gave her an answer. It was not a satisfying answer, but it was an answer, and it was delivered with the respect that he would have delivered it to any landowner present, which was all she'd asked for. On the way out of this meeting, a man she didn't recognize fell into step beside her. He was perhaps 50, weathered, with a direct bearing that reminded her of Benjamin. "Frank Alderman," he said. "Ruth's my wife." "I know Ruth," Eleanor said. "She told me," he said. "Said I ought to introduce myself properly." He walked alongside her for a moment. "That was well done," he said. "In there." "I only asked a question," Eleanor said. "Sometimes that's all it takes," Frank said. She was nearly at her wagon when she heard Alderton's voice behind her, talking to two other men, not bothering to lower his voice. Thomas Whitmore's charity case is what she is. Gave her that land to get rid of her, is what I heard. You wait. Eleanor did not turn around. She did not stop. She put her foot on the wagon step and climbed up and picked up the reins. But her hands, for just a moment, were not quite steady. She sat in the wagon for a count of 3. Then she drove home. When she got back to the farm, she went directly to the barn. She climbed up to check the repaired roof brace in the dim interior, and she sat on a crossbeam for a while in the quiet, listening to the sounds the barn made, its particular creaks and settlings, its alive solidity. And she let herself feel the full weight of what it cost to be in a room where people were deciding who she was. Then she climbed down. She went to the kitchen. She started a pot of soup from the last of the fall vegetables. She cut bread from the loaf she'd baked that morning. She ate. She opened the ledger. Under the column marked progress, she wrote, "Attended county meeting. Asked question. Got answer. Going back next month." Then she turned to the planning pages and she began to write out her vision for the spring. Cattle on the eastern 20. Expansion of the kitchen garden. And, still small in her mind, still only a sketch, a spare room with a proper bed, a table that could seat strangers, a lamp in the window visible from the road, a place where people passing through might stop, a place that said, "You are welcome here." She wrote for a long time. Outside, the October wind picked up, and the barn made its sounds, and the hens in their solid rebuilt coop settled for the night, and the farm, her farm, the 60 acres that were hers not by charity, but by right and by every ounce of work she'd put into the ground since June, was quiet and present and entirely real. She was not a woman waiting anymore. She was a woman with a plan. The spare room was ready by the 1st of March. Eleanor had worked on it through January and February, in the hours after the farm work was done and before the cold made her fingers too stiff for fine carpentry. She had plastered the cracked wall herself, learning the technique from a library book she'd borrowed from Ida Marsh, who kept a small collection of practical volumes behind the post office desk and lent them with the solemn precision of a woman who believed knowledge was the one currency worth circulating freely. She had sanded and refinished the floor. She had made curtains from fabric she'd bought at a reduced price from Gideon Pierce, who had begun, in the quiet incremental way of a man who tracks inventory carefully, to give her the kind of pricing he reserved for reliable customers. The room had a proper bed, not elegant, but solid, with a mattress she'd stuffed herself with clean straw and a wool blanket she'd traded 3 dozen eggs for from a woman in the northern part of the county. There was a small table, a wash basin, a lamp. She stood in the doorway and looked at it and thought, someone tired and far from home could sleep here and feel that the world had some kindness in it. That was all she wanted. Ruth came to see it and stood with her hands clasped in front of her chest and looked around with an expression Eleanor had learned to recognize as Ruth, suppressing strong emotion through force of personality. "It's lovely," Ruth said. "It's plain," Eleanor said. "Plain done with care is lovely," Ruth said firmly. "Don't argue with me about this. What's your plan? Are you hanging a sign?" "I thought I'd start by telling Ida," Eleanor said. "She knows everyone who passes through. If a traveler comes asking about board, she'll send them here." Ruth considered this. "You should charge fair prices," she said. "Not low prices, fair ones. If you undercharge, people will think something's wrong with the place." "I know," Eleanor said. "I've worked out the numbers." "Of course you have," Ruth said, with the particular affection of someone who has come to rely on another person's competence. Ida Marsh received the information about the spare room with the alert interest of a woman who processes everything as potentially useful intelligence. She looked at Eleanor across the post office counter and said, "How many rooms?" "One now," Eleanor said. "I'm considering a second if the demand warrants it." "How's the cooking?" Ida asked. "Better than Ida Marsh's preserves," Eleanor said. Ida's eyes narrowed. Then she laughed, a proper laugh, short and genuine. "Fair point," she said. "I'll send people." The first guest arrived 11 days later. How was a traveling salesman named Walter Pruitt, about 50, with a sample case full of dry goods and the defeated posture of a man who had spent too many nights in accommodations that smelled of other people's tobacco. Ida had sent him with a note that said simply, "Whitmore Farm. Clean, good food, fair price. Tell her Ida sent you." He arrived at Eleanor's door at supper time with the wary hopefulness of someone expecting disappointment. He did not get it. Eleanor gave him a room with clean sheets and a lamp that worked, and a supper of beef stew with biscuits that he ate with the concentrated gratitude of a man who had forgotten that food could taste like someone cared about it. After supper, he sat at her kitchen table. Eleanor always fed guests at the kitchen table, because she was not running a hotel and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. And he held his coffee cup with both hands and said, "I've been traveling this territory for 9 years, Miss Whitmore. I have stayed in every type of accommodation this county has to offer." He paused. "This is the best meal I've had since St. Louis." "St. Louis is a long ways away," Eleanor said. "Yes, it is," he said. She charged him the price she'd calculated, and he paid it without negotiating, which she had not been certain he would. And when he left the next morning, he shook her hand and said he'd be back through in 6 weeks, and could she hold the room? She said she could. He was back in 5. Word traveled the way. Word does in the territories. Through the networks of men who spend their lives on roads, who tell each other where to stop and where to avoid with the careful specificity of people whose comfort depends on accurate information. By late April, Eleanor had hosted 9 guests. By May, she had turned away 2 for lack of space and immediately begun work on the second room. But it was not the guests who changed things in Willow Creek. It was the story of the guests, people in town who had watched Eleanor's farm go from ruin to function with a kind of grudging, at a distance acknowledgement, now had something more specific to react to. Strangers were choosing her farm over the boarding house in town. They were doing so voluntarily. They were coming back. And the salesman Walter Pruitt, who made regular rounds through 6 counties and talked to everyone he met as a professional habit, had apparently told a number of people about the widow on the 60-acre spread. He had called her a widow because he assumed it, and Eleanor had not corrected him, a detail she found faintly amusing, who made the best beef stew in Montana and kept a room so clean you could eat off the floor. She was not a widow. She was an unmarried woman who had been handed a ruined farm and made it into something real. The distinction felt important. It was Charles Harrington who made her understand how important. He came back on a Thursday in the middle of May, and this time he did not bring the 2 men. He came alone, which was different, and he came in the afternoon rather than the morning, which was also different. Not the power move timing of a man making a statement, but the practical timing of a man who wanted a conversation. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard the horse, and she came to the door and looked at him and waited. He took his hat off this time. That alone told her the conversation was going to be different. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I'd like to speak with you, if you have a few minutes." "I have a few minutes," she said. "Come in." She put coffee on because that was what you did. And she set 2 cups on the kitchen table and sat down across from him and waited with her hands flat on the table, the same posture she'd used with Thomas, the posture of a woman who is not in a hurry and is not afraid of whatever comes next. Harrington looked at the kitchen, at the shelves of preserved jars, at the organized workspace, at the quality of the room itself, and she could see him adjusting what he'd expected to find. "You've been accepting travelers," he said. "I have," she said. "The Pruitt man," Harrington said, "and others." "Yes, I have a proposition," he said. "Not a purchase offer." He said it quickly, preempting the refusal she was already forming. "I have a business associate coming through next month from Chicago. Important man. He needs accommodation. Good accommodation. And the boarding house in town is not—" He paused in the way of a man choosing diplomatic language for the opinion that the boarding house was a disgrace, not suitable for his purposes. Eleanor looked at him. "You want to send a Chicago businessman to sleep on my farm," she said. "I want to send a Chicago businessman to the best accommodation in this county," Harrington said, "which appears to be your farm." He said it with the particular difficulty of a man making an admission that costs him something. "His name is Gerald Marsh." "Any relation to Ida?" Eleanor asked. Harrington blinked. Her husband's nephew, he said. From the city branch of the family. Eleanor looked at her coffee cup for a moment. I'll need to know his arrival date 3 days in advance, she said. And my price for a Chicago businessman is a third, again my standard rate. Harrington stared at her. Those are my terms, Eleanor said pleasantly. That's, he started. Those are my terms, she said again, in exactly the same tone. Harrington put his coffee cup down. Something moved through his expression that took a moment to identify. It was, she realized, respect. The kind that comes not from admiration, but from the clean recognition of an equal. All right, he said. After he left, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table for a long moment. Then she went to find Ruth. Charles Harrington just asked me to accommodate his Chicago associate, she said, at a premium rate, because I am apparently now the best option in the county. Ruth sat down on Eleanor's porch steps. She put her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook. Ruth, Eleanor said. I'm not laughing, Ruth said into her hands. You are absolutely laughing, Eleanor said. I'm just... Ruth looked up. Her eyes were bright. You know he offered Thomas twice what that farm is worth when it was still the Harker place? 2 years ago. Thomas turned him down because he wanted the land for himself, and then couldn't keep up the taxes, and that's how it ended up. She stopped. You didn't know that. Eleanor stared at her. Thomas couldn't manage the taxes on it, Ruth said, more carefully. And rather than sell to Harrington, he put it in your name, which let him feel like he was doing something generous rather than just letting it go. The silence that followed had several layers to it. Eleanor worked through all of them. So he wasn't only trying to manage me, she said slowly. He was also solving a tax problem. Eleanor, he solved 2 problems with 1 deed, she said. Got rid of a property he couldn't afford and a sister he didn't know what to do with. She paused. That is actually almost impressive in its efficiency. Ruth looked at her with the careful attention of someone monitoring a situation that could resolve in several very different directions. Eleanor started to laugh. It was not a light laugh. It came from somewhere deep and complicated, and it had the slightly ragged edge of something that had been held in a long time, but it was genuine, and once it started, it took a while to stop. Eleanor, Ruth said again, now with less concern. I'm fine, Eleanor said, not entirely accurately. I'm fine, She shook her head. I spent 4 months being angry at Thomas for being thoughtless, and he wasn't even being thoughtless. He was being efficient. She wiped her eyes. I almost respect it more. You are a very strange woman, Ruth said, with deep affection. I know, Eleanor said. Hand me that coffee. The Chicago businessman, Gerald Marsh, arrived in the 2nd week of June in a rented buggy with 2 leather trunks and the slightly overwhelmed expression of a city man who has underestimated the distances involved in traveling the Montana countryside. He was 40, precise in the way of a man who deals in figures, and he stood at Eleanor's front door with the careful neutrality of someone who has been told a place is good but is reserving judgment. He gave up the neutrality by the end of the first evening. Eleanor did not modify her approach for a man from Chicago. She fed him what she fed everyone, good food, made from what she grew and raised, without apology for its plainness, and without performance of anything other than what it was. She showed him to the better of the 2 rooms. She left him a lamp with enough oil to last the evening and a pitcher of water for the wash basin, and she said good night and went to do her own work. In the morning she made eggs and coffee and fresh bread, and she set it on the kitchen table and called him when it was ready. Gerald Marsh sat down across from her and looked at the breakfast and then at her and said, My associate told me this was the best accommodation in the county. I thought he was being polite. And? Eleanor said. He was being accurate, Marsh said. He stayed 3 days instead of 1, rearranging his schedule by telegram with the particular ease of a man who has the authority to rearrange his own schedule. On his 2nd day, he asked Eleanor, with the careful directness of a man accustomed to business conversations, whether she had considered formalizing the hospitality operation. I have a room, she said. 2 rooms. That's not an operation. It's a farm with visitors. It's a business, he said. A good one. There are people, families, business travelers, people moving west, who would pay for exactly what you're providing. Good food, clean rooms, personal attention. There's nothing like it within 60 miles. Eleanor looked at him. You're a businessman, she said. What would you do? He told her. He was clear and specific, because those were apparently the only modes he had, and what he told her was not complicated. Document the costs, formalize the pricing, establish a reputation through word of mouth, which she had already begun, and expand at a pace she could sustain without sacrificing the quality that made it worth stopping for. You don't need to become a hotel, he said. You need to become the place people tell other people about. You're already that. He gestured at the kitchen, the farm visible through the window, the evidence of organized productivity in every direction. You're already that, he said again. Eleanor thought about the lamp in the window, the table that could seat strangers, the place that said you are welcome here. Thank you, she said. She meant it plainly, and he received it plainly, and that was the entirety of that. What she did not anticipate was what Gerald Marsh did when he got back to Chicago. He wrote a letter to a cousin who wrote for a regional paper. He mentioned, in the course of the letter, the remarkable farm outside Willow Creek, Montana, operated by a Miss Eleanor Whitmore, which offered the finest hospitality he'd encountered in the Western Territories. He mentioned it as an aside, the way a man mentions something he wants to share, but doesn't expect anyone to do much with. His cousin found it charming and mentioned it in a column. The column was short, but it was printed. Eleanor found out about it when 3 people arrived on the same day in late July. 2 families traveling west and a journalist from Helena, who said he was writing about the growth of homestead hospitality in the territory and had seen her name in print. She stood at her door looking at the journalist and said, I saw my name in print? Yes, ma'am, he said. Gerald Marsh's endorsement. It ran in the Chicago paper. You didn't know? I did not know, she said. The journalist, a young man named Calloway, eager and slightly sunburned, produced the clipping from his breast pocket with the pride of a person who has brought a gift. She read it standing at her front door. Gerald Marsh had called her farm a testament to what determined American womanhood can build from nothing. He had called the food the finest I have eaten west of the Mississippi. He had called the hospitality genuine and unaffected, the kind that is becoming increasingly rare in a world that mistakes formality for quality. Eleanor read it twice. She looked up. Come in, she told the journalist. I'll see if I can fit everyone. She fit everyone. It was difficult, and it required her to sleep in the kitchen, but she fit everyone, and she did it without any of the guests being aware of the sacrifice, because that was the kind of thing you didn't let people know about if you wanted them to feel welcome, rather than obligated. Benjamin heard about the newspaper article from 4 separate people before he came to see her about it, which he did on a Sunday evening with the expression of a man who has been waiting for the right moment and has decided this is it. Chicago paper, he said, sitting at her kitchen table. Apparently, Eleanor said. Finest hospitality west of the Mississippi, he said. That's what it said. He looked at her. Something in the quality of his looking had been shifting, incrementally, over the months of their acquaintance. She had been aware of it without examining it too directly, the way you can be aware of weather changing without wanting to name the storm. Are you pleased? He asked. She thought about it honestly. I'm not sure pleased is the right word, she said. It confirmed something. That's what it did. It confirmed that what I was building was real. She turned her coffee cup. I knew it was real, but it helps to have it said out loud, he said quietly. Yes, she said. It helps. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has a shape to it. Eleanor, he said. She looked at him. I have been... He stopped. I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, so you understand exactly what I mean by it. Her heart did something she did not entirely authorize. All right, she said. I have been coming to this farm since August because I find this farm worthwhile, he said. I have been coming because I find the work you do here worthwhile, and the way you think worthwhile, and the way you talk about this land worthwhile. He met her eyes. "And I have been coming because I find your company, particularly, worthwhile." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's a great many worthwhiles," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm working up to something." "I can see that," she said. "I don't want to presume," he said. "I understand that you have built something here that is entirely your own and entirely sufficient, and that you do not need anything added to it. I understand that." He held her gaze. "But I would like, if you were willing, to be in it, in whatever way makes sense to you, as more than a neighbor who borrows fence line." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the first day she'd seen him on the gray horse at the gap in her fence, doing calculations with his eyes. She thought about the lumber he'd brought on a convenient pretext. She thought about "you should enter the fair, and you have as much right to that meeting as anyone," and every small, consistent, undramatic act of recognition that had accumulated over a year into something she had been aware of, but had not let herself examine too directly. "You are the least dramatic man I have ever met," she said. Something moved in his face. "Is that a problem?" he asked. "No," she said. She smiled, a real one, with the full weight of the year behind it. "It's one of the things I find particularly worthwhile." He exhaled. "Good," he said. "Don't presume too much yet," she said. "I have a farm to run." "I know," he said. "So do I." "Then we understand each other," she said. He left an hour later, and Eleanor stood at the window, watching the lights of his lantern move down the road toward his own land, and she felt something in her chest that was warm and somewhat terrifying and entirely welcome. She went to the ledger. She opened it. She did not write anything for a moment. Then she wrote, "Benjamin Carter. Noted." She closed the ledger and went to bed. The storm came without adequate warning in the middle of August. Eleanor had learned Montana weather over the course of the year, its particular habits, and its sudden reversals, and she had learned to read the signs that old-timers read by instinct: the particular color of the afternoon sky, the behavior of the animals, the smell of the air. She had seen bad weather come before. She had not seen anything like this. It started as a thunderstorm of normal scale on a Tuesday afternoon, and became, within 3 hours, something categorically different. The kind of storm that people in this territory referenced for a decade afterward by year rather than name, a marker in time. The rain came horizontal. The lightning was continuous enough to navigate by. The wind pulled a portion of the barn roof that Benjamin had helped reinforce and flung it 50 yards into the east field like it weighed nothing. Eleanor had 4 guests in the house. She got them all into the back rooms, away from the windows. She checked every window herself, latched every shutter, moved the livestock she could move into the protected section of the barn that was still standing. She did all of this with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who has learned that panic is a luxury, and there is always something useful to do. At the height of the storm, her front door opened. It was not the wind. Someone was knocking, and when she unlatched it, she found 2 people on her porch. A woman and a teenage girl, soaked through and white-faced, whose wagon had overturned on the road a quarter mile from Eleanor's gate. The woman's arm was at a wrong angle. The girl was holding it together by sheer will. Eleanor got them inside. She did not hesitate, and she did not perform calm. She simply was calm, the way she had learned to be when there was work to do, because calm was more useful than anything else. "Can you move the fingers?" she asked the woman, whose name she learned later was Helen Soames. "Yes," Helen said through her teeth. "It's not broken, I don't think." "All right," Eleanor said. "Let's get it looked at." She set the arm. She had read about it in her father's almanac, in the medical section, which she had read with the thoroughness she brought to everything, just in case. And it was not broken, as Helen had said, but it was badly wrenched and would need rest. She wrapped it with the practical efficiency of someone who has decided that competence is more useful than squeamishness, and she put Helen and her daughter in her own bed, and went back to managing the house. By midnight, the storm had not abated. By 2 in the morning, Eleanor was standing in her kitchen with 6 people sheltering in her house. Her 4 original guests, Helen Soames and her daughter, and a third family she had not yet met, who had arrived during a momentary lull in the rain, sent by someone who was not there. Someone had apparently told someone on the road that if you needed shelter, you went to the Whitmore farm. She made soup. She made coffee. She lit every lamp in the house. She kept the fire going and she went around to everyone, each person individually, with the focused attention of someone who understands that being seen matters as much as being sheltered. And she checked on them and listened to them and made sure they had what they needed. At 3 in the morning, Benjamin arrived. He came through the door with the rain still coming off his hat and his coat, and he looked at the kitchen full of people, and at Eleanor, who was standing at the stove with her hair down, because she'd had no time to put it up properly, and her apron soaked where she'd leaned over the soup pot. And he took one look at all of it and rolled up his sleeves. "What needs doing?" he said. "The east section of the barn," she said without preamble. "I've got livestock in the protected section, but the gap where the roof came off is letting in water, and I need it boarded before—" "I'll handle it," he said. "You can't go out in—" "Eleanor," he said. "I'll handle it." He went back out into the storm. Eleanor watched the door close behind him, and then she turned back to the stove, because there was soup to manage and people to look after. But she felt something in her chest lock into place with a kind of solidity she had not let herself feel before. He came back in 2 hours later, soaked and muddy, and with a gash on his forearm from a piece of blown debris that he had apparently not considered worth mentioning. "Is that serious?" Eleanor asked, taking his arm without ceremony and examining it. "It's fine," he said. "It needs to be cleaned," she said. "Eleanor?" "Sit down," she said, in a tone she had apparently developed over the course of the year that communicated that arguing was not a useful option. He sat down. She cleaned the gash and wrapped it, and he let her, with the particular patience of a man who has decided that some battles are not worth having. "The barn's boarded," he said. "I know," she said. "Thank you." He looked at the kitchen, at the people sleeping and waiting and warming themselves, at the evidence of the kind of night that reveals exactly what a place is made of. "How many did you shelter?" he said. 6 people, she said. "I need to check on Helen's arm again and—" "Eleanor." He put his uninjured hand over hers on the table, just for a moment, not dramatically, with the plainness that was his particular quality. "Stop for a minute." She stopped. She looked at his hand on hers. She looked at him. "You know what you've built here," he said quietly. "Don't you?" "I'm beginning to," she said. Outside, the storm was finally, gradually, beginning to let go. The rain was still heavy, but the wind had eased, and in the particular way that Montana weather released its hold, the quality of the darkness outside was changing. In Eleanor's kitchen, in the light of every lamp she owned, 6 people slept and rested and recovered. The farm had held. She had made it hold. The next morning, when the storm was fully past, and the sky was the particular washed blue that follows extreme weather, Eleanor stood at her front door and looked at the damage. The east barn section, the fence line down in 2 places, a portion of the kitchen garden flattened by wind. And she made a list in her head, the same way she had made a list on that first day in June of a year ago, standing in front of a ruined farmhouse with 60 acres of nobody's problem and a deed with her name on it. Repair the barn gap properly. Reset the fence posts. Salvage what can be salvaged from the garden. The list was manageable. She knew that now in a way she had not known it a year ago. Not with the defiant hope of someone who has never been tested, but with the settled knowledge of someone who has been tested and found the testing survivable. Helen Soames appeared beside her. Her arm was in the sling Eleanor had made, and she looked at the farm with the particular attention of someone who is seeing something clearly for the first time. "You put 6 people up last night," Helen said. "In a storm, fed everyone, managed the livestock, kept this whole place from going under." She paused. "I heard you up at 3 in the morning checking on everyone." "I didn't want anyone to feel—" Eleanor started. "My mother used to say," Helen said, "that the measure of a person is what they do when nobody's keeping score." She looked at Eleanor. Nobody was keeping score last night. Eleanor looked at her farm. At the barn, boarded against the damage. At her kitchen garden, where some things had survived and some had not. "I was," she said quietly. "I'm always keeping score." Helen looked at her for a moment. Then she said something Eleanor did not expect. "My sister runs the women's auxiliary at the church in Miles City," she said. "She's been looking for someone to speak at their harvest meeting in October. About homesteading. About building something from nothing." She paused. "I'd like to tell her about you, if you'd allow it." Eleanor looked at her. "I'm not," she started. "You are," Helen said simply. "Exactly what they need to hear about." The morning after the storm, before anyone else was up, Charles Harrington rode up the road and stopped at Eleanor's fence line. He sat on his horse and looked at the farm, at the evidence of damage and at the evidence of survival. And Eleanor saw him from the window and went outside because she was not going to have that conversation from inside the house. "Storm hit you hard," he said. "We managed," she said. He looked at the boarded barn, at the fence. He was doing calculations again, but they were different calculations now. She could see that. The math had changed. "I'm not going to make you another purchase offer," he said. "Good," she said. "I'm going to ask you something else instead." He turned his hat in his hands, a gesture she had never seen from him before, and it was so uncharacteristic that she paid close attention. "My east pasture has a drainage problem that's been getting worse for 3 years. I've had 2 different men look at it, and neither of them solved it." He paused. "Ruth Alderman told me you rerouted the drainage on your south field by hand last spring, and it's been working perfectly since." "She told you that," Eleanor said. "She told me that," he confirmed. Eleanor looked at him. "I'll come look at it," she said. "I'm not promising anything until I see the land." "That's fair," he said. She went and looked at his east pasture 2 days later. She walked the entire section, and she asked him questions, and she listened to his answers with the focused attention she brought to anything involving soil and water, and she told him exactly what she thought needed to be done, in plain, specific language, without softening it or making it more complicated than it was. Harrington listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he said, "How do you know all this?" "I paid attention," Eleanor said. It was what she had told Benjamin Carter the first day he'd asked, on the gray horse at the gap in her fence. She had said it then without knowing if it was enough of an answer. She said it now, knowing that it was. Harrington looked at his pasture, then at her. "What would you charge," he said, "to oversee the drainage work?" The number she gave him was fair. He paid it without negotiating. On the ride back to her farm, Eleanor thought about the year that had brought her from Thomas's dining room to this road. She thought about the deed she had folded against her chest. She thought about Orville, the taciturn wagon driver who had left her in the dirt with her trunk and her crates and driven away. She thought about the first morning she had worked the pump until the water ran clear, and the first evening she had written in her ledger, and the first time she had sat in the kitchen with the lamp turned down and known, quietly and without drama, that she was not going to leave. She turned her horse at the gate of her own farm. The barn had held. The house had held. The kitchen garden would come back in the sections that could come back, and what couldn't come back she would replant. And that evening, for the first time since she had arrived on that Thursday in June, with her second-best dress and her borrowed wagon and 60 acres of nobody's problem, Eleanor Whitmore did not open the ledger. She sat on the porch in the August evening air, and she did nothing productive for a full 30 minutes. She looked at her land. She breathed. She thought, "I am still here." She thought, "And I am only getting started." The harvest meeting in Miles City was on the 3rd Saturday of October, and Eleanor almost did not go. Not because she was afraid, exactly. Fear was something she had been acquainted with long enough to recognize its particular flavor, and what she felt in the 2 weeks before the meeting was something adjacent to fear, but not quite it. More the feeling of standing at the edge of something large, uncertain of the footing on the other side. She had built things with her hands and her back and her stubbornness. She had argued with men twice her size about drainage and fair pricing and property rights. She had sheltered strangers in a storm and turned an impossible piece of land into something real. Standing in front of a room full of women and speaking about it was different. She said as much to Ruth, who was sitting on Eleanor's porch on a Tuesday evening 2 weeks before the meeting, shelling the last of the fall beans with the efficient speed of a woman who does not believe in wasting good light. I don't know what I'd say, Eleanor said. You'd say what happened, Ruth said, without looking up from the beans. It sounds simple when you say it like that. It is simple, Ruth said. That's exactly the point. She looked up. Eleanor, those women are going to be sitting in that room because they are tired and overlooked, and most of them have been told at some point in their lives that they are not sufficient to the circumstances they are in. You walked into exactly that situation, and you built something out of it. She held Eleanor's gaze. You don't need a speech. You just need to tell the truth. Eleanor looked at the beans in her lap. You make everything sound manageable, she said. Everything is manageable, Ruth said. It's just unpleasant in varying degrees. Benjamin had a different way of putting it. He came by the following Sunday, and she told him about the meeting and about her hesitation, and he listened the way he always listened, with the full, unhurried attention of a man who has decided that what another person is saying deserves to actually land before he responds. And then he said, When you arrived at this farm, did you know how to replaster a wall? No, she said. Did you know how to set a barn brace? No. Reroute field drainage? Run a hospitality operation? Negotiate with Charles Harrington? He paused after each one. Did you know how to do any of those things when you got here? No, she said. I learned. Then you know how to do this, he said. You just haven't learned it yet. She looked at him. That is either the most useful thing anyone has ever said to me, she said, or a very elegant way of saying you don't know either. Both, he said, without hesitation. She went to the meeting. Helen Soames met her at the church hall door in Miles City and took her arm and walked her in with the particular warmth of a woman who has decided to own her introduction of someone and is proud to do it. The hall was fuller than Eleanor had expected. 60 women, perhaps more, of varying ages, most of them with the particular quality of endurance worn into their faces that she recognized from her own mirror. She stood at the front of the room, and she told the truth. She did not make it dramatic. She did not soften it. She said, My brother gave me a ruined farm to keep me quiet. The roof leaked. The barn leaned. The fields were 10 years gone to weeds. I arrived alone with a trunk and 2 crates and $20 to my name. She said what she had done, month by month, not as a hero's journey, but as a practical accounting of work and decision and error and adjustment. She said what it had cost. She said what it had given back. And then she said the thing she had not planned to say, the thing that came out of her because the room asked it of her, the quality of their listening pulling it forward. People see a woman like me, she said, and they see what is not there. They see no husband, no title, no conventional beauty, no family money. They see absence, and they decide that absence is the whole story. She paused. But I have been on 60 acres for 16 months now, and I can tell you that what grows in a place has nothing to do with what people decided about it before they looked at the soil. This land was not worthless. I was not worthless. We were simply waiting for someone patient enough to believe in us. The room was very quiet. Then a woman in the 4th row, middle-aged, work-worn, with the kind of face that has been outside in all weathers, began to clap. And then the rest of them. Eleanor stood at the front of the room and let it happen, and felt something unlock in her chest that she had not known was locked. Afterward, 9 women came to speak to her individually. 2 of them asked for her advice about their own land situations. One of them, a widow named Martha Gale, who had been running 40 acres alone since her husband died 3 years previous, gripped Eleanor's hand and said in a low voice, I nearly gave it up last spring. I nearly sold. She did not say anything else, but she held Eleanor's hand for a moment longer, and Eleanor understood what she meant and squeezed back. She drove back to Willow Creek in the dark, alone, with the lantern swaying on the side of the wagon, and she felt the distance between who she had been in Thomas's dining room and who she was on this road at this particular hour in this particular October, and the distance was not as large as it sometimes felt. The woman who had taken that deed and pressed it to her chest had always been capable of this. She had simply needed the ground under her. She had found the ground. She was still finding it. The letter from Thomas came 3 days after she returned from Miles City, and it arrived via the post office. not hand-delivered, not brought by one of his men, but properly posted, with a stamp, which told Eleanor before she opened it that he had written it more than once. A man only uses the formal mail for a letter he has revised into its final form. She opened it at Ida's counter, which was where she always read mail that mattered, because Ida's presence was somehow steadying. Thomas had written 4 pages in his careful hand. He did not lead with what he wanted. He led, and this surprised her, with what he'd heard. He had heard about the Miles City meeting from Catherine's cousin, who had been in the audience. He had heard about the Chicago paper endorsement from a business associate who had seen the column. He had heard about the storm sheltering from Frank Alderman, who had told the story at a county meeting 2 weeks after the storm, with a specificity that suggested he had told it before and would tell it again. "I understand," Thomas wrote, in the 3rd page, "that what I did was not the kindness I believed it to be. I have been thinking about this a great deal. I have been thinking about it since I stood in your kitchen and saw what you had made of that place, and I have not had the right words for it until now. I want to say that I am sorry, Eleanor. I am sorry for what I assumed about you. I am sorry for what I did not tell you about the bequest. I am sorry that I needed you to prove yourself before I could see you clearly." She read that paragraph 3 times. Then she read the last page. "I would like, if you are willing, to bring Catherine and the children to Whitmore Farm for Christmas, as you suggested. I would like to come not as your benefactor or your older brother with opinions, but simply as your family, if you will have us." Eleanor folded the letter. Ida was watching her with the careful attention of a woman who knows when not to ask. "Well?" Ida said, when Eleanor had been quiet for what was apparently long enough. "He apologized," Eleanor said. Ida looked at her. "Is it a good apology?" she asked. Eleanor thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. "Yes," she said finally. "It's a very good apology. He knows exactly what he's apologizing for." "Will you forgive him?" Eleanor put the letter in her coat pocket. "I already have," she said. "I forgave him sometime around the harvest fair, I think. I just didn't write him a letter about it." She paused. "I suppose I should have." "Yes," Ida said, in a tone that communicated she had held this opinion for some time. Eleanor wrote back that evening. She kept it short because the essential things did not need much space. "Yes, Thomas. Come for Christmas. Bring everyone. There is room." She sealed it and left it on the table and felt the clean simplicity of it settle through her. The second guest room was finished in November, which meant Whitmore Farm now had 2 proper rooms for travelers and a kitchen that had become, in the 16 months of Eleanor's occupation, one of the most well-equipped in the county. She had invested carefully and specifically. A better stove, a second good lamp, a proper set of pots that she had found, through Ida, at an estate sale 20 miles north. The investment was calculated and documented to the penny in the ledger, and the return on it was measurable in the quality of what came out of the kitchen and the reputation that quality built. Gideon Pierce at the Mercantile was now taking 12 jars of preserves a week and had twice asked for more, which she had declined because she was not willing to extend supply beyond what she could maintain with consistent quality. He had also, in the fall, asked if she would be willing to supply eggs to the hotel restaurant that a man from Bozeman was opening in the new building at the east end of town. She had said yes to that. The egg money, added to the hospitality income, and the produce sales and the consulting fee she had charged Charles Harrington for the drainage work, which had worked, completely and durably, to Harrington's barely concealed satisfaction, gave her a ledger that looked nothing like the number she had arrived with. She did not speak of this to most people. She spoke of it to Ruth and to Martin Gould, who had become, in the course of the property registration and the follow-up business of properly documenting the homestead operation, something between a lawyer and a trusted advisor. And she spoke of it, carefully and specifically, to Benjamin. They had settled into something that had no formal name and did not need one. He came to the farm several evenings a week, and they talked about the land, about the county, about the things she was reading and the things he was thinking about for his own operation. They worked together when there was work that benefited from 2 pairs of hands. They sat on the porch in the evenings when the work was done and the quiet had the particular quality of comfort rather than emptiness. He did not rush her, and she did not rush herself, and the whole thing moved at the pace of something that is growing rather than being constructed, which is the only pace that holds. One evening in late November, when the first snow had come and gone and left the ground hard and silver in the moonlight, they were sitting in her kitchen after supper, and Benjamin put a piece of paper on the table between them. Eleanor looked at it. It was a deed. Not hers. His. The double C. 800 acres, Eastern County. She looked at him. "I want you to see it," he said, "because I want you to understand that what I'm considering asking you is not about land. It's not about combining operations or practical convenience." He held her gaze. "I have 800 acres. You have 60, and what you've done with 60 would run circles around most men's 800. He paused. "I want you to understand that when I ask you—" "Benjamin," she said. "I'm working up to it," he said. "I know," she said. "But you're going to say something very plain and honest, and it's going to be exactly right, and then I'm going to feel the full weight of it and not have anywhere to put it. So." She put her hands flat on the table. "Just say it." He looked at her for a moment. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because it makes practical sense, although it does. Not because the county will think better of you for it, because you have long since passed the point of needing the county's opinion. Because I find you—" He stopped and searched, and she could see him reaching for the word that was accurate rather than the word that was easy. "I find you the most fully realized person I have ever encountered. And I would like to spend the remainder of whatever time I have on this earth in the company of someone who approaches everything, every fence post and fair competition and county meeting and ruined barn, with that quality of—" he paused, "of complete commitment." The kitchen was very quiet. "Complete commitment," Eleanor said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. She thought about the gray horse at the gap in her fence. She thought about cold coffee on a fence rail. She thought about they were wrong, and you should enter the fair and the lumber on a convenient pretext, and a gash on his arm that he had not considered worth mentioning. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. "That quickly?" he said. "I've been thinking about it for 6 months," she said. "You're only just catching up." Something crossed his face that was the closest thing to genuine surprise she had ever seen on it. Then he laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she had heard from him perhaps 3 times in 16 months, each time filed away in her memory as something worth keeping. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "We'll work out the practical details," she said. "I'm not moving off this farm." "I know," he said. "I didn't expect you to." "And I keep the Whitmore name," she said. "Professionally. This is Whitmore Farm." "It should be," he said. "It's what it is." She looked at their hands. "All right," she said. "Then yes." She said it the same way she had said it in Thomas's dining room, to herself, taking the deed. "All right." The words of a woman who has looked at the size of something and decided that the size is not a deterrent. The news of the engagement moved through Willow Creek at the speed that important news moves in small towns, which is the speed of everything, and faster. Ida Marsh received it with an expression of profound personal satisfaction and said she had seen this coming since September of the previous year, which Eleanor doubted but did not argue with. Ruth cried, immediately and without apparent embarrassment, and then said she was absolutely not crying, which was the sort of thing Ruth said, and then hugged Eleanor for a long time. Frank Alderman shook Benjamin's hand and said, "You are a lucky man," in a tone that communicated he meant it as a serious assessment rather than a pleasantry. Benjamin said, "I know," in exactly the same tone. Robert Ames, who had apparently heard the news at the feed store, made a remark to someone that got back to Eleanor through Ruth. Something about how remarkable it was that a woman like her had managed to catch a man like Carter. The remark was delivered in the tone of a man who cannot fully credit something that contradicts his prior assessment of the world. Eleanor, when she heard about it, thought of the word catch and its particular implications, and then she thought, "I did not catch anything. I was standing in the middle of 60 acres of honest work, and a decent man walked up and decided he would like to be there too. And that, she thought, was exactly the right way for it to have happened. The thing she did not anticipate. The thing that no one anticipated, including Charles Harrington, who had by this point abandoned the pretense of indifference toward Eleanor's operation and had begun stopping by with the regularity of a man who has recognized a reliable source of good sense, was what Robert Ames did next. He waited until December, until the engagement was publicly known and settled, and then he sent a letter to Thomas Whitmore. Eleanor found out because Thomas, to his credit, brought her the letter himself. He came out to the farm on a Thursday, before Christmas, and he stood in her kitchen, and he put the letter on the table, and he said, "I thought you should know." She read it. Ames had written to Thomas suggesting, and the word suggesting was doing considerable work in the letter, carrying the full weight of implication without the legal burden of statement, that there might be question about whether Eleanor's farm operation had been conducted with complete propriety, given the frequency of her contact with Benjamin Carter prior to their engagement and the unsupervised nature of the arrangement. He suggested that a man of Thomas's standing might want to look into the matter before the family's reputation was further, the word he used was complicated. Eleanor set the letter down on her kitchen table. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Thomas. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has brought something unpleasant because it is right to bring it and wishes it did not exist. "I want you to pressure me," she said. "Or Benjamin." "Yes," Thomas said. "Or at minimum create enough doubt about my character that the engagement falls apart on its own." "That's what the letter implies," Thomas said. "Why?" Eleanor said. "What possible—" She stopped. She thought about it. Robert Ames, who had called her a heifer at the hardware store, who had been willing to overlook her condition for sufficient dowry, who had been turned down by a note, and who had watched from a distance for 16 months as the woman he had dismissed built something remarkable and was now going to marry one of the most respected men in the county. "Pride," she said. "It's only pride." "Yes," Thomas said. "He can't stand it," she said. It was not a question. "No," Thomas said. "He cannot." Eleanor looked at the letter. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Thomas straightened his coat in the way he did when he had made a decision he was committed to. "I wrote back last night," he said. "I told him that my sister is the most competent person on 60 acres in this county, that her conduct has been above reproach by every account I have received, and that if he sends any correspondence of this nature again, I will make his letter public and let the county decide what it thinks of a man who attacks a woman's reputation because she didn't want to marry him." Eleanor stared at him. It was the longest, most direct sentence she had ever heard Thomas Whitmore deliver. "Thomas," she said. "I also told him," Thomas continued, with the air of a man who has gotten started and is going to finish, "that what he called her condition has produced the finest homestead operation in the territory, and the admiration of a Chicago businessman whose family has connections in Washington, and that a man of his apparent business ambitions might want to think carefully about which side of that story he wants to be on." Silence. "You threatened him with Gerald Marsh," Eleanor said. "I reminded him of a relevant context," Thomas said primly. Eleanor felt something rise in her chest. Not the complicated, layered emotion of their previous encounters, but something simpler, warmer. "Thank you," she said. Thomas looked at her. Something in his face was still working out its resolution. The long, slow process of a man making his way from who he was to who he wants to be, which is never a quick journey. "I owe you considerably more than one letter," he said quietly. "You do," she said. "But the letter is a good start." She walked around the table, and she did something she had not done since she was a girl in her father's house. She put her arms around her brother and held on, briefly and without ceremony, and he put one arm around her with the stiffness of a man who is not practiced at this, but is genuinely trying. Then she stepped back. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee. Catherine and the children are still coming for Christmas?" "If the invitation stands," he said. "It stands," she said. "Sit down, Thomas." He sat down. She made coffee. The first snow that stayed came in the third week of December, and Eleanor Whitmore woke on the morning of Christmas Eve to find her farm transformed by it. The fields white, the barn roof white, the fence lines she had repaired, and the kitchen garden she had put to bed for winter, all quietly covered, and the whole 60 acres silent in the particular way that snow silences a landscape, pressing out everything that isn't essential. She stood at her kitchen window with her first coffee of the morning, and she looked at it all. Thomas and Catherine and the 3 children arrived at noon, which was when she had told them to arrive, which meant Thomas had planned their departure carefully, which was so very Thomas that she had to smile at it. The children came through the door with the barely contained energy of young people in a new place, and the oldest, a girl of 14 named Abigail, stopped in the middle of the kitchen and looked around at the shelves of preserves and the good stove and the organized warmth of it, and said, in the frank tone of a teenager who has not yet learned to veil her assessments, "This is wonderful." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "Father said it was a farm," Abigail said, with a glance at Thomas that communicated she had expected something rather more rustic. "It is a farm," Eleanor said. "It's also a home." "It's both," Abigail said, with the decisive certainty of a girl filing this information correctly. "Can I see the chickens?" Eleanor showed her the chickens. She showed all 3 children the barn and the winter fields and the repaired fence lines, and she answered their questions with the same directness she brought to all questions. And by the time they came back inside, Catherine had set the table with the cloth she'd apparently brought from town, and Thomas was looking at Eleanor's ledger, which she had left open on the kitchen shelf, not as a statement, but simply because she had been working in it that morning, with an expression she didn't fully catch before he noticed her noticing. "May I?" he asked, gesturing at the ledger. "You may," she said. He read through it with the careful attention he gave to financial documents, which was absolute. He read for a long time. When he closed it, he set it back precisely where it had been, and he said nothing for a moment. "Eleanor," he said. "Thomas," she said. "This operation—" He stopped, started again. "Do you know what this operation is worth?" "To the penny," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face that she had seen there all her life. The older brother's certainty, the benevolent authority, had been replaced, gradually and now completely, by something else. Something that looked like admiration, with no qualification attached to it. "Of course you do," he said. Benjamin arrived at 4 in the afternoon, with Frank and Ruth behind him, and Ida Marsh came with a man Eleanor had not met, who turned out to be her husband's brother, visiting from the east, and the kitchen that Eleanor had imagined as a place where strangers could feel welcomed, filled with people who were, by various degrees and kinds of connection, family. She moved through the room, and she fed people, and she listened, and she laughed in the places where laughter was earned, and she felt the full texture of the evening, its warmth and its noise, and its specific humanity, with the attention of someone who knows that the present moment is the thing, the actual thing, that she has been building toward. At one point, she found herself standing near the window with Benjamin beside her, both of them looking at the room rather than at each other. "Is this what you imagined?" he asked quietly. "When you looked at that first empty room and thought about what it could be?" Eleanor looked at her kitchen, at Abigail explaining something to Ruth with great conviction, at Thomas and Frank Alderman in what appeared to be a genuine conversation about crop rotation, at Ida's husband's brother eating his 3rd biscuit without apparent self-consciousness. "No," she said honestly. "I imagined something smaller." But it's better," she said. "What actually happened is better than what I imagined." He was quiet for a moment. "It usually is," he said, "if you do the work." She looked at him. "That is—" "I know," he said. "I'm an extremely wise man." "You are an occasionally wise man," she said, "who sometimes gets lucky." "That's also true," he said. She took his hand. Not dramatically, just took it, the way you take something that belongs to you when you want to hold it for a moment. Outside, the snow was still coming down, soft and continuous, covering the roads and the fence lines and the fields she had turned by hand, the ground she had learned cell by cell, the 60 acres that were hers, not because anyone gave them to her, but because she had put herself into them until they grew back. The wedding was set for spring. Martin Gould had already drawn up the documentation that would make clear, in the legally binding language of the territory, that Whitmore Farm remained Eleanor's property, named, deeded, and operated under her authority, as a condition of the marriage. Benjamin had signed without reading it through more than once, which she had noted. "You didn't read the second page carefully," she said, when he handed it back to Gould. "I trust you," he said. "That is an extremely impractical position," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It's also my position." She had taken the documents and read them herself, twice, with the focused attention she gave to all documents that mattered, and they were exactly what she had asked for. She signed them with the same steady hand with which she had taken the original deed from Thomas's table. The deed that had started all of this. The deed she had pressed to her chest like a wound and carried into 60 acres of nobody's problem. The spring would bring new planting. It would bring the wedding, which would be simple and outdoors and attended by exactly the people who had earned the right to be there. It would bring the third guest room, which she had already designed in her head, and the beginning of what Gerald Marsh had called a real operation, and what she called a place where people could stop and feel that the world had some kindness in it. It would bring, she knew, new problems, new costs, new miscalculations that would require adjustment, new people with opinions about what she should be and shouldn't do, and what was proper for a woman of her. Any of the words they used. She had heard most of them by now. She was ready for all of it, because she had learned, on a particular Thursday in June, in the dirt in front of a ruined farmhouse, standing in her second-best dress with 60 acres of ruin in front of her, that the size of a thing was never the question. The question was always the same. The question was, are you willing to begin? She had been willing. She still was. On the last night of the year, after the guests had gone, and Thomas and his family were sleeping in the 2 rooms, and Benjamin had driven home with the particular reluctance of a man who is counting the months until he does not have to leave, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table alone with the lamp and the ledger. She opened it to the last page of the year's accounts. She looked at the numbers, at the columns of cost and income and investment and return, at the neat record of a year in which she had done, approximately, the impossible. She turned to a clean page. She wrote at the top, Year 2. Then she wrote the first thing that needed doing in the spring. She was still writing when the lamp needed trimming. She trimmed it and kept going. Spring came to Whitmore Farm, the way it always came to that part of Montana. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a killing frost, followed by 3 days of rain, followed by the kind of morning that made you understand why people had crossed a continent to get here. Eleanor had learned to read those arguments by now, the same way she had learned to read the barn's sounds, and the soil's moods, and the particular silence that meant the hens were unsettled about something worth paying attention to. She was in the south field on a Tuesday morning in early April, when Ruth came across the property line at a pace that told Eleanor something had happened before Ruth said a word. "There's a woman at your gate," Ruth said, slightly breathless. "She came on the morning coach from Helena. She says she's a writer." Eleanor straightened up from the row she was turning. "A writer," she said. "For the Helena Independent," Ruth said. "She says she heard your name from Gerald Marsh's cousin, the one who wrote the column." Eleanor pulled off her work gloves. She looked at the south field, at the rows she had planned through January and begun turning in March, at the 60 acres that had been, 2 years ago, a decade of indifference pressed into dirt. Then she looked at the gate. "Then I suppose," she said, "I should go talk to her." The writer's name was Frances Cole, and she was perhaps 30, with a direct gaze and a notebook, and the particular energy of a woman who has been told no enough times that yes surprises her. She stood at Eleanor's front gate with the careful composure of someone who is not certain of her welcome and is determined not to show it. Eleanor opened the gate. "Miss Whitmore?" Frances said. "Come in," Eleanor said. "I'll make coffee." Frances Cole wrote for 2 hours at Eleanor's kitchen table, asking questions with the efficient precision of a woman working against a deadline, and Eleanor answered them the same way she answered everything, plainly, specifically, without embellishment, and without false modesty. She described the deed and the first morning and the pump and the barn and the fair and the storm and the guests and Charles Harrington and the drainage work. She described all of it as the sequence of practical decisions it had been, because that was what it was, and Frances wrote it all down with a speed that suggested she had recognized early that the plain telling was the story. At the end of the 2 hours, Frances put down her pencil and looked at Eleanor directly. Can I ask you something off the record?" she said. "You can ask," Eleanor said. "Do you ever—" Frances stopped, started again. "Was there ever a moment when you believed they were right? That you should have given up?" Eleanor thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about anything. "There was a morning," she said slowly, "about 6 weeks in, before Ruth, before Benjamin, before any of it had resolved into something I could see clearly. I had split my palm open on a fence post, and I couldn't get the bleeding to stop, and I was sitting on the ground with my hand wrapped in my apron, and I was—" She paused. "I was calculating. Whether the numbers worked, whether the work I was putting in would produce anything worth the cost of putting it in." She looked at her hands, the hands that were no longer soft, that bore the particular evidence of 2 years of real work. "I thought about Thomas's dining room, about Robert Ames, about what everyone expected me to do. And," Frances said quietly, "and then I thought about the pump," Eleanor said. "The first day. It had taken me 2 hours to get the water clear, 2 hours of working a rusted pump that I didn't know if I could fix. And the water went from brown to rust to clay-colored to finally clear. And I thought—" She stopped. "I thought, if I can do that, if I can work at one broken thing long enough to make it work, I can do the rest." Frances looked at her for a moment. "That's the story," Frances said. "That's exactly the story." The article appeared in the Helena Independent 3 weeks later. Eleanor read it at Ida's post office counter, because that was where she read things that mattered, and it was. She sat with this for a moment. It was accurate. Frances Cole had written it the way Eleanor had told it. Plainly, specifically, without making her into either a martyr or a miracle. Just a woman who had worked at broken things long enough to make them work. The headline was, "What one woman built from 60 acres nobody wanted." Ida read it over her shoulder and said, "That's going to travel." "I know," Eleanor said. It traveled. By June, Eleanor had received 14 letters. Some were from women she had never met, in places she had never been. Colorado, Wyoming, the Dakota Territory, who had read the article and written because they needed to say to someone that they were still trying, that they were still there, that the thing they were working at had not beaten them yet. Some of the letters were practical, asking for specific advice about soil or livestock, or the business of running hospitality on a working farm. One was from a woman in Oregon, who said she had been handed land she didn't want by a family who didn't know what to do with her, and that she had read Eleanor's story and gone back out to the fields the next morning. Eleanor answered every letter. She did it in the evenings, at the kitchen table, by lamplight, with the same methodical care she brought to the ledger. She answered each one specifically, not with the same words, but with the particular response that each letter asked for. Because every woman who had written about something real, and real things deserved real answers. Ruth found her doing it one evening and stood in the kitchen doorway and watched for a moment before speaking. "How many is that?" Ruth asked. 14 so far, Eleanor said, not looking up. "You're going to be doing this for a while," Ruth said. "I know," Eleanor said. "Good," Ruth said, and she went home. The wedding happened on the second Saturday of May, outdoors, between the south field and the restored barn, in the particular morning light that comes in that part of Montana when the season has finally committed to itself. Eleanor wore her best dress. Not the second best, not the work dress, the actual best, which she had remade over the winter with the patient attention of a woman who believes that a garment can be both honest and beautiful. And she stood in her own field on her own land, and she married Benjamin Carter in front of every person who had earned the right to witness it. Ida Marsh cried, which surprised everyone, including Ida. Ruth did not cry this time, which surprised Eleanor, until she realized Ruth was working too hard at not crying to have energy left for actual crying, which was even more Ruth than crying would have been. Thomas stood in the second row with Catherine beside him and Abigail beside her. And when Eleanor caught his eye, he gave her a nod that contained, she understood, a full accounting of everything he had not said well and was still working on saying. And she gave him a nod back that contained her acceptance of the accounting. Benjamin held her hand through the entire ceremony with the same pressure he had first used on that December evening at the kitchen table. Not possessive, not dramatic, just present. The particular steadiness of a man who has decided where he is and intends to stay there. When it was done and they were married, Eleanor looked at her farm, at the barn and the fields, and the third guest room she had finished in March, and the kitchen garden coming in on the south wall. And she felt the weight of all of it, the specific gravity of 2 years compressed into this one morning. Benjamin leaned close and said quietly, "You're doing the thing where you're somewhere else." "I'm right here," she said. "You're right here and also somewhere about 16 months ago," he said. "I can tell." She looked at him. "I was thinking about the pump," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, with the complete understanding of a man who has heard the story and knows exactly what the pump means. "Still running?" he said. "Still running," she said. There was a supper after the ceremony that lasted until the stars came out, because that was what happened when Eleanor Whitmore fed people. They stayed, because the food was good and the warmth was real, and the particular quality of the place made leaving feel like a decision you needed to justify. Harrington came, which surprised several people, and surprised Eleanor not at all, because she had long since understood that Harrington's initial opposition to her had been the opposition of a man who did not yet know what he was looking at, and once he knew, he had adjusted, because he was, at bottom, a man of accurate assessment. He shook Benjamin's hand and said something in a low voice that made Benjamin laugh, and then he found Eleanor and said, "The eastern pasture had the best fall yield in 3 years." "I know," Eleanor said. "You should think about adjusting the north drainage next." Harrington looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize from him. The slightly reluctant, entirely genuine respect of a man who has stopped fighting an assessment he can no longer rationally dispute. "I was going to ask you about that," he said. "Come by next week," she said. "Bring the survey map." "Yes, ma'am," he said without a trace of irony. She had not, in 2 years and through everything, been called ma'am by Charles Harrington. She let the moment settle for exactly 1 second before she moved on to the next guest, because she had learned, in the same school that had taught her drainage and barn bracing and field rotation and the preservation of tomatoes with apple, that some victories were worth noting and then letting go of, because the work was always the next thing and not the last thing. The third guest room began accepting visitors in June, and by midsummer, Whitmore Farm had a waiting list of 2 weeks for accommodation, which Eleanor had not predicted, and which required organizational adjustment and a conversation with Gideon Pierce about expanded egg supply. The conversation went her way, as her conversations with Gideon Pierce had tended to go since the 8th jar of preserves, because she had learned that the best negotiating position is the one where the other party has already been shown the quality of the work. In July, a woman named Clara Patterson arrived on the morning coach from Billings with a letter of introduction from Martha Gale, the widow who had nearly given up her 40 acres and had held Eleanor's hand at the Miles City meeting, and asked if Eleanor would be willing to take her on as a working apprentice for the summer in exchange for farm labor. Eleanor looked at Clara Patterson, who was 22, and had the particular quality in her eyes of someone who is determined not to let anyone see how desperate they are. And she thought about the morning she had arrived at this farm with a trunk and 2 crates and $20 and a deed she had pressed to her chest like a wound. "Do you know how to work a pump?" Eleanor asked. Clara blinked. "A water pump?" "Yes. If it's rusted and not cooperating," Eleanor said. "How long will you work at it before you give up?" Clara thought about it. "Until it works," she said. Then, more honestly, "or until I'm certain it can't." "How do you tell this difference?" Eleanor asked. "I'm not sure," Clara said. "I've never given up on one yet." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. "You can have the room in the lean-to," she said. "It's small, but it's dry. We start at 5 in the morning, Clara Patterson's shoulders dropped half an inch, the specific drop of someone who has been holding themselves together very tightly and has just been given a place to put the weight. "Thank you, miss," she started. "Mrs. Carter," Eleanor said, "but Eleanor is fine." Clara was the first. By the following spring, she was managing the hospitality side of the operation with a competence that exceeded Eleanor's projections, and Eleanor wrote to Martha Gale to say so, and Martha wrote back to say that Clara had written to her as well, and that she had apparently told everyone she knew in Billings that if they needed to learn something real, they should find their way to Whitmore Farm. Eleanor read that letter and thought, so that is what this becomes. Not just a farm. Not just a homestead with travelers and preserved tomatoes and a drainage consulting arrangement with the largest landowner in the county. A place where women came to learn what they were capable of when someone gave them ground to stand on and the room to work. She talked to Benjamin about it that evening. They were sitting on the porch in the September air, their porch now, their farm, though the deed still said what the deed said and always would. And she told him what she was thinking, plainly, and with the specific detail that the idea had accrued over the weeks she had been considering it. He listened the way he always listened. When she finished, he said, "How many women?" "2 to start," she said. "Maybe 3 if we extend the lean-to. What do you need to make that work?" She told him. He listened to that too, and when she was done, he said, "The timber from the north stand. I was going to sell it in the fall. It would cover the extension and most of the supply cost." She looked at him. "You'd been thinking about this too," she said. "I've been waiting for you to say it out loud," he said. "I didn't want to push." "You never push," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I do prepare." She took his hand. "Benjamin Carter," she said. "You are an occasionally wise man." "So you've said," he said. "I'm choosing to take it as a compliment." "You should," she said. The lean-to extension was finished before the first snow, and 2 women arrived in March of the following year. One from a letter of introduction, one from a letter. Eleanor had written herself to Martha Gale's network in Billings, and Whitmore Farm became, quietly and without announcement, the thing it had always been building toward, a place where forgotten things were given another chance. In the years that followed, the name Whitmore Farm traveled the way her story had traveled, through the networks of women who tell each other what they need to know, through the letters that passed between ranches and small towns and coach stops across the territory, through the particular word of mouth that is the most reliable transmission system ever devised. People came for the rooms and stayed for the work. They came uncertain and left with something they had not had when they arrived. Not a finished person, never a finished person, but a person who had learned that the work itself was the answer. That showing up was the answer. That the pump ran clear if you worked it long enough. Eleanor kept the ledger. She kept it through the good years and the hard ones, through the seasons that surprised her and the ones she'd predicted correctly, and the ones where the predictions didn't matter because the weather had different plans. She kept it through the years when the hospitality operation grew, and the years when she deliberately kept it from growing because she understood the difference between expansion and dilution. She kept it through the births and the deaths and the marriages and the disputes and all the accumulated weather of a life lived fully on ground of her own choosing. On the 10th anniversary of her arrival at the farm, she took the original deed from the drawer where it had lived since that first night, unfolded it, and smoothed it flat on the kitchen table. The paper was worn at the fold lines from all the times she had folded and unfolded it in those early months. In moments of doubt, in moments of decision, in the particular small hours when the only company you have is the thing you are committed to. Her name was still there. Eleanor Marie Whitmore. The 60 acres. The date in Thomas's hand. Benjamin was at the table with her, and he saw her looking at it, and he said nothing, because he had learned in 10 years of mornings and evenings at this table that the right response to Eleanor looking at something was to let her look. After a while she said, "Do you know what Thomas said to me the day he gave me this?" "He said you had let yourself go," Benjamin said. He remembered. She had told him, in the plain, specific way she told him everything. "He said the farm would give you something to do." "Yes," she said. "And did it?" he said, quietly. with the particular quality of a man who is asking something that has more than one answer. Eleanor looked at the deed, at the fold lines, at her name. She thought about the pump running clear. She thought about the barn brace and the harvest fair, and the tin box in the lean-to, and Thomas's 4 pages in careful ink, and Francis Cole's notebook, and Clara Patterson's shoulders dropping that half-inch, and 14 letters answered by lamplight, and a room that said, "You are welcome here in every language a room can speak." She thought about all of it, the whole architecture of the 10 years, and she felt its weight with the steadiness of a woman who has learned to carry weight not because she has to, but because she chose to, which is the only way carrying works. "It gave me everything," she said. Benjamin looked at her. "No," he said. "You gave it everything. There's a difference." Eleanor folded the deed on its old lines. She put it back in the drawer. Then she stood up and went to the door and looked out at Whitmore Farm in the October morning light. At the fields she had turned by hand. At the barn she had braced and reinforced and rebuilt. At the fence lines she had repaired post by post. At the 3 rooms where the lamps would be lit tonight for whoever was coming. And she understood, completely and without sentimentality, exactly what she had built and what it had cost and what it was worth. She was not a woman who had been saved by a farm. She was a woman who had saved one. And everything that stood on those 60 acres, every jar on every shelf, every repaired board, every cleared field, every stranger who had stopped at her gate and found a lamp burning and a table set, and a woman who looked at them like they were worth looking at, was the proof of the one true thing she had known since the morning she pressed a worthless deed to her chest and said all right to the size of what was in front of her. A broken thing is not the end of the story. It is where the real one begins.